From New York, this is Democracy Now!
In order to be able to gear up, we need a broad waiver that covers that whole web of intellectual property rights that Big Pharma right now has that's constricting the ability of countries around the world to make these meds.
Pressure is growing on the Biden administration to support a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization to help gear up the production of vaccines, treatments, and diagnostic tests so desperately needed in the Global South. But Big Pharma is fighting the proposal. WTO meetings on the issue have just begun in Geneva. We'll go to Washington to speak with Lori Wallach of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, then to the Philippines to speak with Walden Bello, co-founder of Focus on the Global South.
It's an emergency that we have to put human lives above corporate profits.
We'll also talk to Walden Bello about the pandemic in the Philippines and U.S.-China relations. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. India reported another record daily COVID-19 death toll today with close to 3,800 fatalities. The World Health Organization says India accounted for nearly half of all global COVID cases reported last week, and 1 in 4 deaths, as the government of Narendra Modi is coming under mounting calls to impose a national lockdown. India's official infection and death figures are believed to be vast undercounts. In Britain, India's entire delegation to the G7 summit in London is in self-isolation after 2 of its members tested positive for COVID-19. India's Foreign Minister, Subramanyam Jaishankar, and all Indian delegates will attend meetings virtually. Tanzania announced new measures on travelers entering the country to prevent the spread of COVID-19 variants. The move comes 2 months after Samia Suluhu Hassan replaced the late John Magufuli, who downplayed the pandemic as Tanzania's president. In the Seychelles, which has the world's highest vaccination rate, officials are closing schools and reimposing other restrictions as infections surge. Over 60% of the Seychelles adult population is fully vaccinated. Here in the United States, COVID-19 cases and deaths continue to trend downwards, but some regions are seeing new surges, including in Arizona and the Pacific Northwest. On Tuesday, President Biden announced a new vaccination goal.
Our goal by July 4th is to have 70% of adult Americans with at least 1 shot and 160 million Americans fully vaccinated. That means giving close to 100 million shots, some first shots, others second shots, over the next 60 days.
President Biden urged people in their 20s and 30s in particular to get the vaccine. Currently, 56% of the adult population has received at least 1 shot. As supply starts to outpace demand in some states, the White House will begin keeping unordered doses in federal banks so they can be made available for other states who have higher vaccination demand. Pfizer says it'll seek emergency use authorization in September for its vaccine to be given to children aged 2 to 11. The FDA is expected to clear the vaccine for children 12 to 15 years old by early next week. Meanwhile, Pfizer announced Tuesday its COVID-19 vaccine brought in $3.5 billion in revenue in the first 3 months of 2021, by far its biggest source of revenue. Pfizer expects to make $26 billion in revenue this year. In news from Capitol Hill, more than half the House Democratic caucus called on President Biden a letter Tuesday to stop blocking an effort to waive patent rights for COVID-19 vaccines at the World Trade Organization. They write, quote, "We must make vaccines, testing, and treatments available everywhere if we are going to crush the virus anywhere," unquote. The WTO is meeting today and tomorrow to discuss the waiver. We'll have more on this for the rest of the show after headlines. In New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed legislation extending a moratorium on evictions through August 31st. The moratorium was set to expire May 1st. New York is also expected to start distributing $2.4 billion in rental assistance. Despite these measures, many New Yorkers are still at risk of losing their homes. At least 50,000 eviction cases have been filed in New York City since the start of the pandemic, the highest number in the country. In California, police arrested a suspect in the stabbing attack on 2 Asian American women Tuesday afternoon in San Francisco. This comes after at least 4 assaults on Asian Americans were reported in New York City over the weekend, including a hammer attack on 2 women walking in Manhattan. A new study by Cal State San Bernardino found a 164% increase in reports of anti-Asian violence in the first quarter of this year compared to the same period last year in the United States. An attorney for former Minneapolis police officer and convicted murderer Derek Chauvin filed a motion for a new trial Tuesday, alleging prosecutorial misconduct, juror misconduct, witness intimidation, and negative publicity around the case. The Office of Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison said it would oppose the defense's arguments. Last week, Ellison called for a harsher prison sentence for Chauvin because of the, quote, particular cruelty of his crime. Chauvin's due to be sentenced on June 25th. A warning to our audience, the following stories contain graphic descriptions of gender-based and other violence. In Massachusetts, questions are mounting following the April death of 16-year-old Michaela Miller, a black LGBTQ teenager from the Boston suburb of Hopkinton. An investigation is ongoing, but the district attorney's office has already come under fire after initially saying no foul play was suspected. Michaela's mother reportedly said her daughter was assaulted, then tied to a tree. A community vigil is planned for Thursday. In Puerto Rico, hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets in recent days in response to the femicides of 27-year-old Keishla Rodriguez and 35-year-old Andrea Ruiz. Ruiz's body was found Friday covered in burns. Her ex-partner confessed to her murder. Ruiz had sought protection against him, but the courts denied it. And Rodriguez, who was pregnant, was found lifeless, floating in the San Jose Lagoon Saturday after being reported missing the day before. Prominent boxer Felix Verdejo Sanchez, who represented Puerto Rico at the 2012 Olympics, has been charged with Rodriguez's murder. Feminist leaders are demanding Puerto Rican Governor Pedro Pierluisi take action against skyrocketing gender violence on the island.
We
demand the state hold itself accountable and tell us where the real state of emergency is. The entire country is shocked by the recent murders of women, horror stories that resonate with so many of us, not only because we see ourselves reflected in each of them, but because we also share the same vulnerability.
The Intercept is reporting the Trump Justice Department repeatedly contacted and eventually threatened to subpoena 2 researchers at MIT over their analysis of the 2019 Bolivian presidential election. The MIT study debunked claims of electoral fraud in Bolivia, which were used to help justify a coup against President Evo Morales. Warning to our viewers, this story contains graphic footage of police violence. In Colombia, as massive demonstrations against poverty and inequality continue, the United Nations has condemned police and military officers for violently cracking down on protesters. At least 19 people have been killed since protests erupted last week against now withdrawn proposed tax reforms introduced by the right-wing President Ivan Duque. Over 400 people have reportedly been detained and hundreds more injured. Meanwhile, here in New York, a demonstration is planned today to protest a New York University event featuring former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe. He has long been accused of human rights abuses and linked to right-wing paramilitary groups. He's also celebrated recent violence against protesters. A group of indigenous leaders and members of Mexico's Zapatista movement have set sail on the Atlantic Ocean to Spain. The group is marking 500 years of indigenous resistance after Spanish colonizers arrived to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which later became Mexico City. These Zapatistas hope to arrive in Spain in August and will go on tour to Europe and share their plans to fight the inequities triggered by capitalism. In related news, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has offered a formal apology to the Maya indigenous community.
We offer the most sincere apologies to the Mayan people for the terrible abuses committed by national and foreign authorities during the conquest, during the 3 centuries of colonial domination and 2 centuries of independent Mexico.
The Mexican president was joined by Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei at the ceremony, which was held in the southern state of Quintana Roo. This comes as the Mexican president continues to support the construction of a massive railway in southern Mexico that would cut through sacred indigenous land and ancient sites. And in Guatemala, indigenous land and water defenders continue to be brutalized, criminalized, and displaced under Giammattei's government. In Afghanistan, fighting between government forces and the Taliban has forced thousands to flee their homes in southern Helmand province as the U.S. military started its official withdrawal over the weekend. Attacks have been surging leading up to May 1st, the previous pullout date agreed to by the Trump administration. Biden announced the U.S. will withdraw instead by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Fighting was also reported in other parts of Afghanistan. Back in the United States, President Biden has tapped Richard Cordray, the former director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to manage the federal student and program within the Department of Education. The move was welcomed by progressives and student campaigners, and many top Democrats continue to pressure Biden to use executive action to cancel at least $50,000 in student debt per borrower. A federal judge has ordered the Justice Department to turn over an internal memo used by then-Attorney General Bill Barr in 2019 to justify clearing former President Trump of obstructing justice in relation to the Russia investigation. The judge accused Barr of misleading her court and Congress about advice he said he received on the matter from top Justice Department officials. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released its updated figures for U.S. climate averages, with the new normal 1 degree hotter than it was just 20 years ago. The data also shows the U.S. is much wetter in the eastern and central parts of the country and drier in the west. The rising temperatures mean that places like Fairbanks, Alaska, are no longer classified as a subarctic climate, but are now considered part of a warm summer continental zone. And in France, a new bill aimed at addressing the nation's response to the climate crisis passed its first vote Tuesday. The bill includes a ban on short domestic flights when there's an alternative train route, restrictions on landlords renting out poorly insulated properties, and making ecocide a punishable crime. But climate groups say the measures are still too weak. This is Jean-François Julliard of Greenpeace France.
It's a law that could have been sufficient if it had been passed 15 years ago, when the climate emergency was less pressing. Today, in 2021, that law will unfortunately not be sufficient to effectively tackle global warming. It is far from ambitious enough, far from allowing to reach the target the government has set itself, namely reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. When we come back, we speak with Lori Wallach of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch about today's important World Trade Organization meeting in Geneva. Calls are growing for the WTO to waive intellectual property rights to help gear up the production of vaccines, treatments, and diagnostic tests so desperately needed in the Global South. Stay with us.
How to
Going Up in Flames by Charles Bradley. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. You can sign up for our daily news digest email by texting Democracy Now!, one word, no space, to 66866 today. That's Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. This is Democracy Now! Pressure is growing on the Biden administration to support a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights for COVID-related medicines and vaccines at the World Trade Organization. The WTO has just begun 2 days of talks in Geneva. India and South Africa first proposed the waiver in October, but it was blocked by the United States and other wealthy countries of the WTO. Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical companies, have also come out against the proposal and has lobbied Washington to preserve its monopoly control. Supporters of the waivers say they're critically needed to gear up the production level of vaccines, treatments, and diagnostic tests so desperately needed in the Global South. More than 100 countries have supported the waivers at the WTO. The majority of House Democrats here in the U.S. have also signed a letter to Biden urging him to back the waivers. The letter reads in part, "Your administration has an incredible opportunity to reverse the damage done by the Trump administration to our nation's global reputation and restore America's public health leadership on the world stage," unquote. On Sunday, Senator Bernie Sanders voiced support for the waivers during an appearance on Meet the Press.
We should deal with this issue through the World Trade Organization of protecting the intellectual property rights of the drug companies. And I think what we have got to say right now to the drug companies, when millions of lives are at stake around the world, yes, allow other countries to have these intellectual property rights so that they can produce the vaccines that are desperately needed in poor countries. There is something morally objectionable about rich countries being able to get that vaccine, and yet millions and billions of people in poor countries are unable to afford it.
This all comes as Pfizer has just announced its COVID-19 vaccine brought in $3.5 billion in revenue in the first 3 months of 2021. Pfizer expects to make $26 billion in revenue this year. Joining us in Washington, D.C. is Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. She and Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz recently co-wrote a piece in the Washington Post headlined, "Preserving Intellectual Property Barriers to COVID-19 Vaccines is Morally Wrong and Foolish." Explain why, Lori, and explain what needs to be done.
Good morning. The big problem is simply not enough vaccines are being produced. And that's because a handful of vaccine-originating pharmaceutical corporations have monopoly control over the production. And they're unwilling and have actually rejected requests from qualified manufacturers around the world to pay them to be able to make more doses. The world needs 10 to 15 billion doses to reach herd immunity. And right now, all of the global production together is on track to make about 6 billion doses this year. So at issue is a proposal that India and South Africa put forward in October at the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has rules in a thing called the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. It's called the TRIPS Agreement for short, that requires all of the WTO members to guarantee the pharmaceutical companies monopoly control of production. So the proposal is simply to temporarily, for the COVID emergency, waive 4 parts of that agreement that cover the 4 specific types of intellectual property, now protecting the vaccines from being made in greater volume, as well as treatments and diagnostic tests, and basically to allow countries around the world to have producers make, in each region, enough vaccines so everyone can actually get vaccinated. It's not just the morally necessary thing to do with millions of lives at stake. It is selfishly in the interest of the United States, because we can vaccinate everyone, and the Biden administration is doing a great job. But if there is any outbreak anywhere, it's where a vaccine-resistant, more deadly, more infectious variant of the virus can hatch. And we'll all end up in a global lockdown if we don't get everyone immunized in shorter order.
So can I ask you about the Biden administration's links to Big Pharma? Many ties to the vaccine makers. The White House advisor Anita Dunn, co-founder of the consulting firm SKDK, which works closely with Pfizer. Biden's domestic policy advisor Susan Rice holds up to $5 million in Johnson & Johnson. White House science advisor Eric Lander holds up to $1 million in shares of BioNTech, which co-developed Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine. On Monday, I spoke to The Intercept's Lee Fang about the ties and also about the Albright group that many in Biden's inner circle come from. This is what he said.
The fact that the number 34 undersecretaries of the State Department were at a consulting firm, Albright Stonebridge Group, that represented Pfizer, that Anita Dunn, she's not someone who's mentioned a lot in the media recently, but she's one of the closest advisors to the Biden administration. She was the de facto campaign manager for his presidential campaign. Her consulting firm represents Pfizer, engages in a lot of the PR and advertising for that firm. These are serious conflicts of interest, and they deserve some scrutiny given the fact that Pfizer is looking at this product, this vaccine, as its massive moneymaker. One estimate shows that Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine, under even the kind of negotiated prices that are deeply discounted this year for U.S. consumers, that will bring in something like $15 billion a year, making it one of the highest grossing pharmaceutical products of all time. And they're already talking about raising prices. So Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, they have so much money at stake. They're leaning on lobbyists. They're leaning on former Democratic aides and on potentially some of these folks who they have ties with in the White House to push back on any effort to allow a generic vaccine.
Lee, so there you have Lee Fang of The Intercept. Your response to this sort of cocoon of, Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, the drug-industrial complex in this country, the pharmaceutical-industrial complex. Is Biden and his inner circle protecting their benefactors?
Here's the bottom line. This decision's going to be made by President Biden. And President Biden personally to the camera directly promised America in a conversation with Addie Barkan, heroic, challenged by ALS, healthcare activist, super activist, that he would not allow the intellectual property rights of pharma to interfere with the world getting access to these vaccines. And throughout Congress, throughout the activist world, the Vatican, everyone is saying to Biden, Mr. Biden, deliver on this promise. Whomever he is surrounded by, regardless of what is truly a tsunami of pharma lobbyists, they're here all the time. Amy, they have a ratio where they have one lobbyist for every 20 members of Congress. It's not just that we all are running around as citizens trying to get our members of Congress to do something. They are so thick on the ground that they're always trying to get their way. But here's the difference. 60% of the U.S. public, as divided as we are, has said absolutely there should be a waiver. The opposition to it in the U.S. is minuscule. To some degree, if you're not for it, it's because you don't know about it. It's not rocket science. It is a first critical step to having the chance to end this pandemic as quickly as possible. So it's on Biden to follow through regardless of who is speaking in his ear. And many people in the administration, by the way, are for the waiver. So today in Geneva, the U.S. is going to have to take a position. And here's what's the worst piece of this whole thing. They're not blocking adoption of a specific waiver. Since October, starting with Trump, the United States of America has blocked more than 100 other countries merely having a negotiation about the text of a waiver. We have stopped the negotiations. The WTO works by consensus. To launch a new negotiation, you can't have any major country blocking it. The U.S. blocked it. The European Union and Switzerland and the U.K. snuck up behind and said, us too. So as soon as the U.S. gets the hell out of the way, that's all we're saying, stop blocking the negotiations. Because there is a text, it's a draft. If there are problems in it, the negotiations can address specific problems. That then needs to still be adopted. The U.S. doesn't have to be the cheerleader for it. They need to get out of the way. What is the look of the U.S., thanks to the Biden administration stepping up? We're all going to, anyone who needs a vaccination and wants one will have one by the summer. And yet we are the country that is going to block 100+ countries being able to do the initiative they say is necessary for them to have the same thing we already have. And the only potentially upset party is a handful of pharma companies that got billions in our taxpayer money. They had no risk in this. They got billions in advance. And then they're making billions, as Li Fang said. So in this moment, it is not just the morally right thing. It is the only thing to be done to stop the pandemic, is to get vaccines into everyone. And this waiver is part of the answer to that.
And yet you have people like, well, one of the Democrats backed by Big Pharma who opposes signing the waiver is the senator from President Biden's home state, Delaware, his very close ally, Chris Coons. Coons ranks 16th among congressional recipients of pharmaceutical industry lobbying money. During an address last month to the Washington think tank, Center for Strategic International Studies, he echoed the drug companies' talking points. When Senator Coons refers to IP, he means intellectual property. This is what he said.
If we were to simply open up to the world all of the IP at the core of these groundbreaking developments, I think we would then be at risk of losing the private sector investment and development that's critical to this moment of personalized medicine, of breakthrough vaccines, of breakthrough medical diagnostics. And I think, frankly, the world would suffer as a result. So, as I said, I don't think that waiving IP rights will suddenly enable other countries the ability to ramp up the manufacturing of complex vaccines. Instead, I'm urging that the Biden administration and the private sector work together in a coordinated effort to manufacture, distribute, and administer vaccines rapidly and equitably globally. Let me close by being optimistic about our ability to invest in innovation, science, and competitiveness here in the United States. A central part of being successful in this competition is continuing with our constitutionally created protected property right of a patent, something I've long believed in.
So that's Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Your response, Lori Wallach.
There are some outliers who are corporate-funded Democratic hacks about this. There's no doubt about it. There are a couple in the House as well. The bottom line of all of this is the vast majority of Americans, of Democratic members of Congress, of countries around the world, don't buy that ridiculous argument. I mean, one very important thing, separate from just the moral imperative of, if this were a movie, this is where we're facing the zombie apocalypse. Everyone is going to die, yet there is a solution. If greed can just be gotten out of the way, to just cut to the chase of what is going on here. But this sort of thinking that he has is premised on just a false claim that the mRNA, this terrific newly exploited technology for the vaccine, is somehow U.S. technology. Number one, it's not new. The original breakthrough was by a Hungarian scientist in the early 80s. And number two, it's not U.S. So the patent, that is the Pfizer drug's key mRNA technology, is held by two Turkish people who live in Germany. That's the BioNTech company. But also around the world, this research has been happening. So for instance, right now in third stage trials, China has its own mRNA platform vaccine underway. The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is being made under contract for Chinese use by a Chinese firm. So this sort of nationalistic notion of it's ours and we shouldn't share in the face of death and destruction. By the way, Senator Coons, destruction of the U.S. economy that is so integrated in the global economy. If you want to just be crass about it, look at the International Chamber of Commerce study that said under a scenario where rich countries are vaccinated, but developing countries aren't in 2021, the global losses to the global economy, $9.2 trillion with a T, trillion dollars, half of it in the rich countries. This is avoidable if we can get herd immunity, vaccination, and end the pandemic. And that is not going to happen unless more vaccine is made. Is part of where it should be made here? Absolutely. We should make as much as we can here, and we should send it elsewhere. But it will not be sufficient. the World Health Organization, scholars around the world agree. There need to be regional hubs. We can help fund them, but they need access to the technology, the recipes, the know-how to be able to make these drugs. Just yesterday, at a high-level webinar, the ambassadors from India and South Africa repeated data that's been in lots of U.S. publications. 1 billion more doses could be made now in the shorter term, in months, if this information, if the waiver happened and the information was public, because there's unused existing capacity in Global South producers that are top-notch, already highly qualified, make very technical biologic drugs for AIDS, the HPV vaccine, et cetera. So they're already in the short term, more can be made, but there's going to have to be investment in the U.S., around the world, to have more production capacity. And the first step is getting the information, which, by the way, Amy, we already paid for. $110 billion globally have been invested, have been transferred to the pharmaceutical industry from governments, the U.S., in Europe, and yet we don't have the vaccines.
And they are deploying that in lobbying Congress. And let's not forget the media. Kuhn's speech won him rare accolades from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which wrote it, hope President Biden, quote, ignores the left and heeds Mr. Kuhn's. You have the Washington Post coming out with a piece against the waiver yesterday, an editorial. And then you have White House coronavirus advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci, who also just weighed in against the waivers, telling the Financial Times, going back and forth, consuming time and lawyers in a legal argument about waivers. That's not the end game. People are dying around the world, and we have to get vaccines into their arms in the fastest and most efficient way possible. Laura, your response.
I was on a call last week with Dr. Fauci, and actually he says that, and he says that after, of course, we need to do a waiver, but we can't waste all our time fighting over the waiver. There's so many other steps. Yes, we need to share the know-how, and then we need to get the investment, and then we need to get the different centers around the world going, and then we have to get the companies to actually share the know-how. So there has been an effort for a month by the pharmaceutical industry to make it seem like Fauci is against the waiver. And actually, I think I can hear in my head the very context in which that statement was made, in the context of what he said over and over, which is, of course, we need to share the know-how and the technology and get vaccines made.
And so what is your understanding, Lori, of the battle that is going on within the Biden administration right now over these waivers? And again, this is the critical moment because the World Trade Organization is having these 2 days of meetings today and tomorrow in Geneva.
So there are some interests that are against the waiver. There are two camps. There is the pharma corporate camp. You can see that in the Trademark and Patent Office and the Commerce Department. And then you have the camp of, we should focus on getting more shots into people. Let's focus on our domestic vaccination rollout, as if making sure that a variant that undoes our domestic vaccine rollout, if there is a vaccine-resistant strain that emerges because there are raging outbreaks anywhere, you can vaccinate 70% of the American public, as the president said yesterday, and we're still locked down again because a vaccine-resistant variant can brew any place there are major outbreaks going on. So it's very short-sighted that us first, them later. On the other hand, there are several key agencies, many people in the White House who are for the waiver and want to get past the waiver in the sense that that is a key step, but that is certainly not going to translate like that into having more vaccines. There's so much more work that has to happen, which is why it is so critical that today the United States stop blocking 100+ countries that simply want to have a negotiation about what they deem as critically important for their people to be able to have what we have, access to the vaccine that can save their lives, but also to contribute to the global fight to crush this pandemic. We do not want this to be an endemic problem that is raging around the world, much less in the current apartheid form of rich countries getting vaccinated and poor countries being left to die. But also, in addition to the moral implication of that, to not be able to help in what is got to be a global effort of a race against vaccines versus variants. And if that does not, if humans don't win that, then there is no place, not here, not with our vaccines, that will be safe.
Lori Wallach, we want to thank you for being with us. Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, wrote the recent Washington Post op-ed with the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. Preserving intellectual property barriers to COVID-19 vaccines is morally wrong and foolish. We will link to it at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, we go to the Global South, to the Manila, to the Philippines, to talk with Walden Bello, co-founder of Focus on the Global South, about the pandemic in the Philippines and U.S.-China relations. Stay with us.
Masdan mo ang mga ulap, balikan mo ang iyong alaala, mga araw na lumipas sa iyong buhay. Malalaman mo kung papaano liligaya sa buhay pagdating ng panahon. Pagdating ng panahon, naalala mo pa ba ang iyong kahapon? Hinahanap mo ang landas.
Period of Time by Juan de la Cruz Band. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. You can watch, listen, and read transcripts using our iOS and Android apps. You can download them for free from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store today. This is Democracy Now! As we continue our coverage of the World Trade Organization and the fight over intellectual property rights during the pandemic. We're joined by the acclaimed Filipino scholar and activist Walden Bello, the co-founder of Focus on the Global South. He's an adjunct professor at Binghamton University and a former member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines. His new op-ed in the New York Times is headlined, "The West has been hoarding more than vaccines." Walden Bello, thanks for joining us again from Manila. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't you start off by talking about the significance of these meetings and what difference it would make for people in the Philippines and in Asia overall, in the Global South for that matter?
Well, as you know, because of the shortage of vaccines, we are in a situation where only about 0.2 or 0.3% of the population of the Global South has had access to vaccines. And here, for instance, in the Philippines, it's only been around 260,000 people, or 0.025 of the population of 110 million people who have had access to vaccines. And, there's no certainty about when these vaccines will arrive. We have mainly gotten a few shipments from AstraZeneca, a significant number of donations from China, and just the last 2 days, the Sputnik V or Sputnik 5 from Russia arrived. But with respect to the Western vaccines, there's a very great deal of uncertainty when those would in fact be coming, because of the fact, that a lot of vaccines that should have been going to the South have been hoarded by the European Union and by the United States. If the press officer or of the Biden administration, Ms. Psaki, has in fact said that our policy is to be oversupplied. And one of the things that the Biden administration did in response to the situation in India was to say it was going to be sending about 60 million doses of AstraZeneca. And it was found out in a report in the New York Times that those are potentially spoiled vaccines that were produced by this factory in Maryland that had been contaminated.
That also produced the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that led to a halt on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca somehow contaminated each other at this factory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, when people heard that, my God, they're sending spoiled vaccines to India. And that was taken as sort of, well, let's send the spoiled stuff to the global south, and we're going to keep the good stuff, here in the United States. So that's been sort of the mixed messaging that has been taking place with the rhetoric of the Biden administration. I think it is going to be very important what happens in Geneva over the next 2 days. As Lori Wallach says, the decision point is, will the U.S. stop blocking negotiations, okay, or will it continue Trump's policy? And, this is the inflection point for the Biden administration with respect to the global south. If it fails this one, there's just going to be tremendous distrust of U.S. foreign policy initiatives. So the test for Biden and, for the global south has come very early. But then you don't choose the time when these things, come on. And as far as I know at this point, it's we don't know exactly what is the thinking of the administration going into Geneva. And it's kept its cards very close to its vest. And but as I said in my column, in my guest editorial in the New York Times, Mr. Biden, knows, what is the right thing to do. And the question is, will he have the courage to do the right thing?
Walden Bello, have you gotten a vaccine?
Yes, I have. As a senior, I was a priority. It's called A2. And we were given the first dose of the vaccine. Okay, so seniors in my city got the first dose of the vaccine. But, the vast numbers of people, aside from seniors and from healthcare workers, frontline workers, have not gotten the vaccine yet. So, and will we get the second dose? We don't know. It all depends, again, on developments in India and developments in different parts of the world. Now, we would not have been facing this supply problem if when the India and South Africa had proposed the waiver the first time around, October of last year, and the U.S. and the rich countries, the other rich countries, hadn't blocked it, we could have moved already to be able to, get the formulas for the vaccine, the technologies to bring them out, repurposing, as Lori said, the big pharmaceutical capacities of a number of different countries in the global south, like South Africa, India, Thailand. So that could have already begun. But here then is the tragedy that, we lost all that time. We lost about 6 months because the U.S. was just not cooperating. It just was so short-sighted, and it was caving in all the time to the pharmaceutical companies who are tremendously unpopular in the global south, but also in the United States, because these companies are just raking it, as we heard earlier, the billions that Pfizer is making, it's mainly out of the biggest moneymaker has been the Pfizer vaccine over the last several months. So it's this very, very big contrast between what are the needs of humanity and what are the needs of these people in the drug industry, which not only are they making tremendous profits for their shareholders, but we're talking about executives that head these people, these corporations, making tremendous amounts, in terms of their salaries, ranging from around 15 million to 25 million a year. These are the people, basically, among the 1% who are making these decisions to block what would be benefits for the global poor, which is to live, allow them to live. So this is really, if I may put it this way, this shows, the tremendous, irrationality of global capitalism, where profits for a few takes precedence over the lives of many. This is why my sense is that the dynamics of this period of the pandemic has really exposed why we need to overcome capitalism to get out of this system that allows these decisions to be made by a few, creates tremendous inequalities, and allows a lot of people to die because the medicines or the vaccines that would allow them to live are being blocked.
So I want to talk about the Philippines. We've heard a lot about India, which we cannot hear enough about. They are going through a COVID tsunami. The Philippines has recorded over 1 million COVID cases and at least 17,500 deaths, the single highest in Southeast Asia next to Indonesia, the second highest. Many hospitals are struggling to handle the latest surge in cases. I want to turn to a doctor in Manila.
The hospital at the NCR, especially the government hospitals, they are now struggling. We noted an increase in the number of cases, just as we noted increase in the number of health workers being positive. In the past, especially in the past since March.
So if you could talk about the crisis in the Philippines and Asia, but also a poll has just come out that was done in some 53 countries. And it says the U.S. is seen around the world now as more of a threat to democracy than Russia or China. And this goes to the difference between how Russia and China is dealing with the rest of the world and these vaccines and other technologies, medical treatments, and what the U.S. is seen as around the world.
Yes. Over here in the Philippines and in a number of other Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia and Thailand, there has been this second wave that has been occurring since early March. And the second wave has been more devastating than the first wave in 2020. In the Philippines, they've been, for a couple of weeks, records of infections were being broken almost every day. Within the last week, for instance, the infections have ranged from around 7,000 to 9,000 people being infected every day, and so we have a situation which is pretty bad in terms of hospital space having run out. People, especially about 2 weeks ago, they've had to keep, people in tents outside the hospitals. Some of them were even just in their cars. There have been incidents of people who couldn't get into the hospital and just died in their car. And then, like we've heard in India, there's been a shortage of oxygen. and stores running out of oxygen tanks. And, basically, something, it's not as bad as what's happening in India, but certainly it was pretty rough. And people were just not, prepared for this situation. Now, several factors really come into play here. One, of course, is the glitch in the vaccination program, mainly because the supplies aren't coming in because of the hoarding by the Western countries. The second, thing has been, to some extent, a sort of becoming a bit complacent, in terms of social distancing and a number of other very important measures like, face masks being worn properly. But I think a big factor, and I think this is the central factor, is that the government has just been so inefficient and incompetent in dealing with this situation.
So you had President Duterte at first saying he's not going to take the vaccine. That enraged public health officials. Now he's taken the Chinese vaccine. And Walden Bello, I wanted to ask you about China and U.S.-China relations in light of all of this. On Tuesday, foreign ministers from G7 nations met in London. They're continuing to meet. China topped the agenda. This comes as both China and the United States are accusing each other of escalating tensions in the South China Sea. Last week, the Chinese government claimed there's been a 40% increase of activity by U.S. planes in Chinese-claimed areas since Biden took office. Activity of U.S. military ships is up 20%. On Sunday, Secretary of State Tony Blinken appeared on 60 Minutes and accused China of acting in increasingly adversarial ways.
It is the one country in the world that has the military, economic, diplomatic capacity to undermine or challenge the rules-based order that we care so much about and are determined to defend. But I want to be very clear about something, and this is important. Our purpose is not to contain China, to hold it back, to keep it down. It is to uphold this rules-based order that China is posing a challenge to. Anyone who poses a challenge to that order, we're going to stand up and defend it.
That's the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. And Walden Bello, I was wondering if you can weave this in. We've been having this discussion about vaccines and the U.S. really being seen in the eyes of the world right now as more of a danger to the world, especially when compared to Russia and China. Russia and China getting out their own vaccines and facilitating others. The U.S. not doing the same at this point. If you can link that to this also increased tension between China and the United States.
Yes. First of all, I think that, when people look at what the Trump administration did, with respect to blocking the TRIPS waiver, and then contrast that to the way that China was shipping Chinese vaccines, Sinovac, Sinopharm, to countries in the global South, there was a very big contrast there. In fact, these shipments were donations being given. Now, in the case of the Philippines, for instance, the Sinovac, is the only vaccines until about 2 days ago that were available for the general population. Yes, we had the AstraZeneca vaccine from Europe. That had come in, and seniors were vaccinated with it. But the vast majority has been Sinovac, that has come in. So I think in terms of the impact on the global South, there's been that contrast. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, this, sort of donations of the Chinese vaccine has, however, been seen suspiciously by a large part of the population as basically China's effort to buy off the government in terms of the sovereignty rights in the South China Sea, or what we call here the West Philippine Sea. Because the Duterte administration has, in fact, hardly protested, against the moves of China in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea around taking, over and infringing on maritime formations that lie within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. And so, we have the situation within the South China Sea where by a number of the countries here, including the Philippines and Vietnam, feel that they have been really disadvantaged by China's claiming that the whole South China Sea or West Philippine Sea belongs to it alone, 90% of that, whereas all these other 5 other countries border on it. Now, that's a basic injustice. Let me put it that way. That's, really territorial aggrandizement, that's taking place. However, okay, and China mustn't be doing that. However, you really need to look at it within this broader regional context where China is surrounded by something like in the order of 55 to 60 U.S. military bases coming down from Japan to South Korea to Guam to the Philippines, where they have 5 bases over here. You've got to look at it in the context of the South China Sea. In fact, basically the 7th Fleet of the United States has deployed itself, and considers that basically a free zone for its ships. And so what we're seeing is that China's perspective or posture has been that of strategic defense. And even the Pentagon admits that China's strategic posture is that of strategic defense, whereas that of the United States is more of an offensive, rapid, forward deployment, And basically what I want to say is this, okay? China's moves in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea are not justified, they're illegal, but at the same time, they are made in terms of a strategic response to U.S. encirclement and heightened U.S. military activity, okay? And Blinken, that's why we need to look at this, Blinken's statement, it's a warmongering statement. I mean, they came like gangbusters in the Anchorage meeting about 2 months ago, where Blinken
we have 10 seconds, Walden.
Yes, acted so arrogantly towards the Chinese, So I guess my point is this: what Trump's anti-China policy is now also being followed by the administrations of the Biden administration's.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we will continue to explore this issue. Thank you so much to Walden Bello, acclaimed Filipino scholar. I'm Amy Goodman.